The dim glow of the diner's neon sign flickered against the rainy New York streets as Emily Porter wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that night. It had been a long shift, too many rude customers, not enough tips, and rent creeping up like an unwelcome shadow in the back of her mind. She sighed, tucking a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear, and turned her attention to the last customer of the evening. He sat quietly at a corner booth, his hood drawn over his head, his long legs stretched beneath the table. Something about him seemed familiar, but Emily was too exhausted to think much of it. When she approached, she noticed the unmistakable sharp features, the distinct blonde hair, and the way he carried himself, polite yet reserved. Her breath caught in her throat. Barron Trump. She knew who he was instantly, the son of a billionaire, a name constantly in the news, a figure surrounded by both admiration and controversy. What was he doing alone in a rundown 24-hour diner at nearly midnight? Forcing herself to act natural, she offered a tired but polite smile. "Hey there. Anything else I can get you?" He glanced up, his blue eyes scanning her face, and then he shook his head. "Just the check, please." Emily nodded, quickly tearing the receipt from her notepad and placing it on the table. She didn't expect much. People with money usually tipped terribly. They assumed everyone else had the same privileges they did. Still, she had treated him just like any other customer. That was her job, after all. Barron hesitated before reaching into his jacket. His fingers brushed over the pen as he scribbled something onto the receipt, then slid his credit card over it. He didn't say a word as she took it to the register. As she swiped the card and printed the receipt, her heart sank. The total was standard. The tip, non-existent. A sinking disappointment settled in her chest. Typical rich kid, she thought bitterly. But when she returned to the table, Barron was already gone, the receipt folded neatly on the table beneath the salt shaker. Emily sighed, reaching for it with little expectation. She unfolded it, preparing for the usual disappointment. Maybe a $5 tip if she was lucky. Then she saw it. Her breath hitched. Her hands began to shake. There, scrawled in blue ink, was a number so large it made her stomach drop, and beneath it, a handwritten note. "For your kindness. Pay it forward." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't just a tip. This was life-changing. But why? Why her? And more importantly, what was she going to do with it? Emily's hands trembled as she stared at the receipt. She blinked, thinking maybe her exhausted mind was playing tricks on her. But no, the number was real. $10,000. Her breath came in shallow gasps. A tip like this didn't happen in real life, not to people like her. This was the kind of thing you read about in feel-good news stories, the kind of miracle that only seemed to happen to someone else. Her legs felt unsteady as she gripped the counter for support. The diner was nearly empty now, the neon lights humming softly above her. She looked around, as if expecting Barron Trump to step out from the shadows and say it was all a joke, but he was gone. "Emily, you okay?" Her manager, a grizzled man in his 50s named Hank, stepped out from the back, wiping grease off his hands. His usual gruff expression softened when he saw her pale face. She swallowed hard, lifting the receipt. "Look at this." Hank squinted, adjusting his glasses as he took the paper from her hands. His brows shot up so fast they nearly disappeared into his hairline. "Holy hell," he muttered. "That's got to be a mistake." Emily shook her head. He wrote a note. "For your kindness, pay it forward." Her voice wavered. Hank let out a low whistle. That was the Trump kid, wasn't it? She nodded. "Well, damn." He handed the receipt back to her. "What are you going to do?" That was the question, wasn't it? She could hardly believe it was real. A small part of her feared the bank would reject the tip, that someone would call her and say there had been a mix-up. But another part of her, the hopeful, desperate part, wanted to believe this was hers to keep. She thought about her overdue rent, the electric bill sitting on her counter at home, the second-hand sneakers her little brother Tommy had been wearing for 2 years straight. This money could change everything. But then, she looked at the note again. Pay it forward. Barron Trump hadn't just left her a tip, he had given her a challenge. A choice. Could she really just spend it all on herself? The weight of it settled heavily on her chest. Emily had worked at the diner for years, watching tired mothers count coins to pay for a single meal, seeing elderly regulars struggle to afford their coffee. She knew what it was like to feel helpless, to need a break. Maybe this was her chance to make a difference. Her fingers tightened around the receipt. She had been given a gift. Now, she had to decide what to do with it. And deep down, she already knew. Emily Porter was about to change more lives than just her own. The next morning, Emily woke up with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The receipt was still on her nightstand, the inked numbers staring back at her like a dream she was afraid to wake from. She thought about keeping it all, paying off her rent, fixing her car, buying Tommy those new sneakers. It would be so easy, but the words "pay it forward" kept echoing in her mind. She couldn't ignore them. By noon, Emily had a plan. She wasn't about to waste this gift. If Barron Trump believed in kindness, she would make sure his generosity reached as many people as possible. First, she stopped by the thrift store and picked up warm coats, socks, and gloves. Winter was brutal in New York, and she knew how many people on the streets would go cold at night. She handed out the clothes to those huddled in doorways and subway stations, their eyes widening in shock as she pressed soft, warm fabric into their hands. Next, she went to the grocery store. She didn't fill a cart with expensive luxuries, just essentials: bread, milk, eggs, rice, canned goods. Then she made her way to the neighborhood shelter and left everything at the donation desk. The volunteer, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, stared at Emily in surprise. "This is a lot," she said. "Are you sure?" Emily only smiled. "It's the least I can do." By the evening, she was back at the diner for another shift. She had spent nearly half the money already, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. As she tied her apron, Hank gave her a curious look. "Heard you were playing Santa Claus today." Emily smirked. "Something like that." He grunted. "You keep giving it all away. You won't have anything left for yourself." "I know," she admitted. "But maybe that's the point." She glanced around at the usual customers, regulars who came in not just for the food but for warmth, for a break from the world outside. There was the elderly woman who always ordered the cheapest soup on the menu, the single father who scraped together enough change for a meal after his shift at the factory, the young college student who looked exhausted and barely touched his coffee. These were the people who needed a break, and tonight she would make sure they got one. As the orders came in, Emily whispered to Hank, "Put their bills on me. Every single one." His eyebrows shot up. "You serious?" "Dead serious." One by one, customers finished their meals and reached for their wallets, only to be told their meals had been covered. Confused looks turned into tears, into grateful smiles, into shaky voices asking, Who did this?" Emily never said a word, but she knew Barron Trump's kindness had started something bigger than either of them could have imagined. By the end of her shift, Emily had spent nearly every dollar of Barron Trump's tip. Yet, instead of regret, she felt something else, something unfamiliar but deeply fulfilling: peace. As she untied her apron and grabbed her coat, she noticed something odd. A small group of customers lingered near the counter, whispering among themselves. Normally, people left as soon as they finished eating, but tonight was different. An older woman, the same one who always ordered the cheapest soup, walked up to Emily with tears in her eyes. "Was it you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Did you pay for my meal?" Emily hesitated, then gave a small nod. The woman reached for Emily's hand and squeezed it tightly. "Bless you, child. You don't know how much this means. I was down to my last few dollars. I didn't know what I was going to do tomorrow." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "You don't have to worry about tomorrow," she said softly. The woman wiped her eyes, nodded, and shuffled out the door. Then something incredible happened. One by one, other customers came forward, people Emily had secretly helped throughout the night. Instead of just thanking her, they pulled out their own wallets, handing over crumpled bills and loose change. "For the next person who needs it," one man said. "I can afford to help someone else now." said another. Even the tired college student, who looked like he barely had enough money to buy his coffee, dropped a few dollars onto the counter. "You inspired me," he admitted shyly. Emily stared at the growing pile of money in disbelief. She had set out to give, but now the kindness was coming back in ways she never expected. Hank stood beside her, shaking his head with a smirk. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks like you started a movement." Emily let out a breathless laugh. "I didn't do anything special," Hank scoffed. "Kid, that's where you're wrong." As the last customers left and the diner grew quiet again, Emily sat at the counter, staring at the pile of money. It wasn't $10,000, but it was enough to keep the kindness going. She realized something important that night. Generosity wasn't about how much money you had. It was about what you did with what you had. She thought about Barron Trump, the young man who had started all of this with one simple act. Had he known what his tip would inspire? Did he realize that because of him, strangers were now helping strangers? Emily smiled. She didn't know if she would ever see him again, but if she did, she knew exactly what she'd say. "Thank you, not just for me, but for all of us." The next morning, Emily woke up to something she never expected. Her phone buzzing nonstop. At first, she thought it was just another spam call, but when she checked her notifications, her breath caught in her throat. Her story had gone viral. Someone at the diner must have posted about what happened, because now social media was flooded with messages about the waitress who paid it forward. People were sharing her story, calling it an act of kindness that restored their faith in humanity. News outlets had picked it up. Some people praised Barron Trump for starting the chain reaction, while others focused on how Emily had used his generosity to help others. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the comments. This is what the world needs more of. Imagine if we all paid it forward like this. Barron Trump did something incredible, but Emily made it even bigger. Her heart pounded. She had never wanted attention. She had only wanted to do the right thing. But now, the entire world seemed to know about it. A knock at the door startled her. She jumped, heart racing, before hesitantly opening it. Hank stood there, arms crossed, shaking his head in amusement. "Well, kid, you're famous." She let out a nervous laugh. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it real." He handed her a newspaper. Front page. Emily's eyes widened as she saw her own face, a photo someone had taken at the diner. The headline read, "Barron Trump's act of kindness inspires a movement." She swallowed hard. "This is crazy," Hank nodded. "It is, but you know what's even crazier?" "What?" He handed her an envelope. "A guy in a suit came by earlier, said this was for you." Emily hesitated before carefully opening it. Inside was a handwritten note and a check. Her breath caught as she read the words. "Emily, you proved that kindness multiplies. Let's keep it going. Barron." Her eyes flickered down to the check and her knees nearly buckled. $50,000. She pressed a hand to her mouth. He had seen what she did. He had seen what his money had started. And now, he was giving her another chance to change lives. Tears blurred her vision. She could fix her life with this money. She could pay off her debts, take care of Tommy, finally breathe without the weight of financial stress crushing her. But she also knew, deep in her heart, that she couldn't stop here. Barron had trusted her with this gift. Now it was time to do something even bigger. And this time, the whole world was watching. Emily sat at her tiny kitchen table, staring at the check. $50,000. A number so large it felt unreal. A number that could erase all her struggles in an instant. She could finally pay off her rent. She could move herself and Tommy into a better apartment, one where the heat worked in the winter and the ceiling didn't leak when it rained. She could quit the diner and find something better. But then, she thought about the people at the shelter. The old woman who had hugged her for paying for a simple bowl of soup. The college student who had given his last few dollars to keep the kindness going. The strangers who had stepped forward, inspired by what she had done. Emily knew she couldn't take this money and disappear. This wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to everyone. So, she made a decision. With a deep breath, she grabbed her phone and started making calls. A week later, the diner was packed, not with customers but with people who had come to give instead of take. The small movement Emily had started had turned into something massive. Donations poured in, not just from locals but from strangers across the country who had read about her story. Some sent money, others sent supplies, warm clothes, food, school materials for kids who needed them. Hank had agreed to host a kindness fundraiser at the diner, turning it into a hub for people in need. Volunteers served free meals, handing out groceries and essentials to families who were struggling. No one was turned away. As Emily moved through the crowd, she couldn't stop smiling. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about humanity. Then, a hush spread across the diner as someone new walked in. Emily turned, her heart skipping a beat. Barron Trump stood at the entrance, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might turn around and leave, but then he walked toward her. The crowd parted, whispers spreading through the room. Emily swallowed hard. I wasn't expecting you. He gave a small smile. I wasn't expecting you to do all this. She laughed softly, glancing around at the people, the overflowing donations, the warmth that had spread far beyond what either of them had imagined. I guess kindness is contagious. Barron studied her for a moment, then nodded. I wanted to see for myself. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out another envelope, pressing it into her hands. And I wanted to help again. Emily's fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing another check. She gasped. $250,000. Her eyes snapped up to his. Barron, he shrugged. This is just the beginning. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. She had started with nothing. Now, she was part of something far greater than herself, and she knew. This was only the start of a revolution in kindness. Kindness has the power to change lives, and this story proves it. But here's the real question. If you were given $50,000 to make an impact, how would you use it? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you believe in the power of generosity, hit subscribe. Not because I asked, but because the world needs more people like you.